Good evening, Professor. This is Jeffrey Rima. I'm going to talk to you today about airport operations, specifically traffic patterns at non-towered airports. So the first thing we talk about here is the units that discuss non-towered airport operations, and that's, of course, our 14 CFR Part 91, our Airman's Information Manual, our Airplane Flying Handbook, our non-towered airport operations circular advisory, our advisory circular 90-66 Bravo, which is the most current advisory circular for non-towered airport operations, Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, and Private Pilots Airplane Airman Certification or Standards or ACS. The learning goal today is to be able to safely and confidently fly a traffic pattern at a non-towered airport. The success criteria is going to be the student is able to safely enter and fly a traffic pattern at a non-towered airport, understand the elements of a traffic pattern, and know the proper procedures and rules when flying in a traffic pattern. Heading back to that, there's a few things that we're going to have to skip over just due to time constraints. That's going to be communication, the difference between towered airports, so on and so forth. So this is going to be an abbreviated model of probably a much larger training session. So for the introduction, every pilot has to be able to aviate, navigate, and communicate when flying in the airport environment. This is for safety reasons, this is for efficiency reasons, and of course, it's where all flights begin and end. So this is a very important step for the private pilot to be able to learn and understand how to fly in a traffic pattern. Pre-assessment. So how do you enter a traffic pattern? What are standard pattern altitudes in a traffic pattern? What are the different legs and what are they called? And how do you depart a traffic pattern when you're ready to leave? These are all things we're getting ready to discuss. So non-towered airports. First off, a non-towered airport does not have an operating control tower. That's why it's non-towered. Two-way radio communications are not generally required. Although it is a good operating practice and all pilots should be able to transmit their intentions on specified frequencies, and this is for the benefit of all traffic to include the pilot flying. The key to communicating at an airport without an operating control tower is the selection of the common traffic frequency, or a CTAF, and this is found on your sectionals and chart supplements. It's up to the pilot at a non-towered airport to determine traffic direction and comply with the appropriate rules. So the standard traffic pattern. Traffic pattern altitude is usually 1,000 feet AGL. Traffic patterns are key to minimize, or altitudes are key to minimizing collisions, because if all airplanes are flying at the same altitude, pilots inside the traffic pattern or entering the traffic pattern know where to look for other aircraft and are able to maintain separation and safety. Any non-standard traffic pattern is going to be listed in the chart supplements is going to be listed in the chart supplement. So it's important to read those chart supplements to know what traffic pattern altitude is at your airport of destination. Standard traffic patterns contain only left turns, so you'll hear left traffic. Non-standard traffic patterns have right turns, and that's going to be dependent on noise abatement issues, terrain issues, and other things that are made for safety. So that's also going to be found in your chart supplement and also on your VFR sectional charts. All turns inside of a traffic pattern should not exceed 30 degrees of bank. I tell everybody that I fly with, and I try to stick to this rule myself, 20 degrees of bank is the maximum bank altitude or bank angles inside of a traffic pattern. This is obviously for safety. Since you're low to the ground, you're flying at slower air speeds to prevent stalls or spins from happening low to the ground. And lastly, but not least, maintaining coordination is absolutely paramount when flying in a traffic pattern. This is because an uncoordinated airplane is going to, when it stalls, is going to spin, and spins at low altitudes ultimately result in catastrophic errors. So here's a picture of a traffic pattern. It has 4 different legs. It has an entry, a final, a departure, the crosswind, downwind, and base. So entry into the traffic pattern should be made at traffic pattern altitude. Again, standard traffic pattern altitude is 1,000 feet above ground level. Entry should be made at a 45-degree angle, abeam the midpoint of the downwind leg if already positioned on the downwind side of the airport. Crossing over midfield is another way, if you're on the opposite side of the airfield, to enter the traffic pattern. So there's two ways to do that, which we're going to discuss. The preferred entry is going to be the teardrop entry, where the pilot flies 500 feet above pattern altitude. And what they do is they fly outside of, or about 2 miles past the traffic pattern, and then they make a right turn, a 360 or really a 270 degree turn, and enter the traffic pattern at a 45 degree angle, just like they would if they were on the same side as the traffic pattern for the airfield. The alternate method is when the pilot crosses at traffic pattern altitude and turns directly left into the left pattern at the midfield point. So this next slide is a picture which depicts how to enter a traffic pattern if on the opposite side of the airfield. Using my pointer here, I can show you that for the teardrop entry, this is the preferred method. The airplane flies 500 feet over a traffic pattern, flies approximately 2 miles away from the traffic pattern, does this right turn, and descends down to traffic pattern altitude in the turn. This is so they're able to enter the traffic pattern at traffic pattern altitude on a 45 degree angle, the same way they would if they started on this side of the airfield coming straight in. And then they continue to fly the traffic pattern. It's important to yield to downwind traffic to make sure that there's no collisions and you maintain separation. If necessary, you can extend this to add extra separation for departing traffic. The alternate way is over here on the right side of the slide, and that's when you fly in at pattern altitude and turn left directly into the pattern. The reason that this is the alternate, not the preferred method, is because this method you have to yield to downwind traffic flying and also traffic entering on a 45. So you have to yield to two different bits of traffic as opposed to just one in the preferred method. So the traffic pattern legs. You have the upwind leg, which is the departure leg. You have the crosswind leg, which is 90 degrees perpendicular to the upwind. You have the downwind leg, which is parallel to the upwind leg, but flying the opposite direction, and is approximately half mile from the runway. This is where you do all your before landing checks, your flaps, your gear, your slow down. This all happens in the downwind leg. Descent is normally started in the downwind leg once you're abeam the point of intended touchdown. So once you hit those 1,000-foot markers, that's when you pull your power back, you start your descent, and you fly in at your airplane's recommended airspeed. The downwind leg continues to a point approximately 45 degrees if in a left pattern off your left shoulder to your intended landing point, and that's where you're going to start your base turn. The turn to base is started at the end of the downwind leg. This can be adjusted as necessary for based on circumstances such as wind, other traffic, an emergency situation on the airfield, and you can adjust accordingly in your downwind leg. Your base leg is perpendicular, like I said earlier, to the downwind and final, and this is where again you're going to start losing altitude. You're going to try to maintain your ground track by crabbing into the wind if necessary, and you're going to continue your descent, maintaining airspeed, glide slope, and your aiming point. And you begin to turn on final in order to end up established on the center line of the runway. So final is the descent and approach leg of the pattern, and this is when you're aligned with the runway and you adjust your turn from base in order to obtain center line. So if you're a little too far left, a little too far right, this is where you make those final adjustments. If you're too far to the left or too far to the right, this is where you decide you can go around. Crabbing into the wind to maintain ground track, so you stay down that center line of the runway, and you adjust pitch and power as necessary to maintain airspeed, glide slope, and your aiming point. Departing traffic pattern. So this is where you're on the upwind leg. So you climb out on the upwind leg. If remaining in the pattern, turn the crosswind leg, pass the departure into the runway, and not until you reach 300 feet of your pattern altitude. So if your pattern altitude is 1,000 feet MSL, because you're at a sea level airport, you're going to turn crosswind at about 700 feet. If departing, you can continue straight out, or you make a 45 degree left-hand turn, or if you're in a right pattern, right-hand turn. Adequate spacing. So for adequate spacing, it's important to observe other aircraft and maintain separation. At a non-powered towered airport, this is the responsibility of every pilot. On downwind, like we said earlier, you can delay your base turns for adequate spacing. On the upwind leg, you can continue straight until you create enough space. And if you are at a towered airport, ATC could request certain maneuvers such as 360-degree turns or S turns to give yourself a little bit extra spacing. Even at towered airports, I want to throw this in there, it's important that you maintain your own separation. It's still your responsibility in visual conditions. Common errors are obviously inadequate spacing. Wind shear is a problem. It's a hazard in traffic pattern, especially coming into land. And the best way to avoid the wind shear is just to avoid convective activity altogether, so thunderstorms, things like that. If wind shear is unavoidable, try to land at a higher airspeed, enough to where you still don't float, and you can come in and make a nice, easy touchdown on the runway. Stay as high as practical in case you lose any airspeed or altitude, and it's important to avoid wake turbulence as well. So if you're taking off behind a larger jet, rotate prior to the point where they took off, and that's going to keep you above the wake turbulence. On landing, try to land higher and beyond the landing aircraft in front of you. Or you could wait it out altogether. Some of the common errors associated with flying traffic patterns is fail to comply with traffic pattern instructions, procedures, and rules, improper correction for wind drift, inadequate spacing, and poor altitude and airspeed control. This is your private pilot ACS standards for traffic patterns and airports and sea base operations. Obviously, we referred to Part 91, the Airman's Flying Handbook, the Airplane Flying Handbook, and the AIM. These are all the knowledge and risk assessment skills you need to know. Obviously, aircraft, terrain, obstacles, any wires, distractions in the pattern, loss of situational awareness, and proper task management. Wake turbulence and wind shear is all risk management things that you as a pilot need to be able to identify and mitigate. So that concludes our lesson today on traffic patterns. Like I said, there's more to go into when it comes to towered airports, when it comes to the rectangular course and your ground reference maneuvers. These are all things we're going to learn and be able to put together so you, as the student, can fly into both a towered and a non-towered airport. But after this lesson, hopefully you understand what we talked about earlier when we went over the learning objectives here, and you can answer these questions in the pre-assessment. So how do you enter a traffic pattern? You enter a 45-degree, or you enter one of those, either the preferred method or the alternate method if you're on the opposite side of the runway as the traffic pattern. What is the standard traffic pattern altitude? We discussed it's 1,000 feet. The different legs in the traffic pattern, you have the upwind, crosswind, downwind, and base. And then you also have final. And how do you depart a traffic pattern? Like we said, straight out. Or if in a left pattern, 45-degree left-hand turn, or a right pattern, it's the same thing but to the right. So hope you have a nice day. I hope you learned something. I tried to keep this as short as possible within our time constraints. So without further ado, hope you enjoyed the lesson, and have a nice night.